of tips and tricks with the two chicks quilting on a Tuesday with Nicole. So today our tips and tricks is going to be over machine binding. So there are so many different ways to put binding on a quilt or a project. This is just one way that we do it here at Two Chicks. It's all machine done. It's easy, it's quick, it's beginner friendly, and we just like to put it on this way. Now there's a couple of different ways that you can do machine binding, so I'm just going to teach you one way. One thing that you do need to have with you is your top thread that is going to match your binding, and then your bobbin thread that's going to match the back of the quilt. The reason we are doing that is because we attach our binding to the back of the quilt and then flip it over to the front and stitch. We aren't that accurate, which you can be, find the perfect placing on your machine and how to stitch it. But with ours, we do have a line that echoes the binding all the way around. Now you probably cannot see it on this quilt because I do have matching bobbin thread in to help blend it in and for all my imperfections. And then we top stitch using a thread that matches our binding for the top. So this is just how we do it. Like I said, there's a lot of ways you can do it, but you do need a bobbin thread to match your backing and a top thread to match your binding. Now, we cut our strips 2.5 inches, and how we calculate to figure out our strips, the amount that we need, is we're going to add the width twice and the length twice. We're going to get that total and divide by 40. The reason we are dividing by 40 is because usually you can get 40 inches out of a width of fabric after you cut your selvages off, and that's going to give you a number. It can be 2, 2.8, 5.8, whatever that number is. We do need to round up to the next number, which would be 3 in our case, and that means we need 3 strips to complete the binding around our quilt or our project that we're making. Now don't forget, you do have to do 3 times 2.5 to get the total yardage or total inches that you need in order to cut your binding. Like I said, that is with us cutting 2.5 inches. If you were cutting yours 2 3/4, 3 inches, you would times that number of strips you need by that to get your total amount that you need for your quilt. So like I said, we cut ours 2.5 inches. And when I go to start piecing my strips together, I like to piece it on the diagonal. This reduces bulk when we fold it over to then attach it to our quilt. So the less bulk that we have, the prettier it will lay, the prettier it will be. So right now I just have any color of thread in my machine, but you could go ahead and put in your top thread and your bottom thread. And there are so many other types of tips and tricks and feet that you can use to help with your binding. I'm working on the Bernina machine. I do have my dual feed in because I feel like it feeds everything better due to the thickness that we're going to be sewing through. And I start with my 1/4 inch, and then I go to my zigzag foot to top stitch. You can do it all on your zigzag foot if you feel comfortable, or you can find other feet that make it a breeze for you. Just know that binding, you will not be perfect the first time. The more you practice, the better you get. So I have my bobbin thread in, I have my top thread in that matches my top of my binding, bobbin that matches the back of my quilt, and we're going to go ahead and get started piecing our binding strips together. So my first one I have right side up. My second one I have right side down. So they're kissing each other, right sides together. I do have it overlapped. You can see about 1/4 inch, and I'm going to now sew on the diagonal. If you don't have a laser light or markings on your tabletop or anything like that, you can take a ruler and a friction pin and draw diagonally and sew right on that diagonal. So let's go ahead. And of course it says my bobbin. Let's get that taken care of. Get that fixed. And let's sew that again. Okay, So now I sewed on the diagonal on the back, and when I flip it over and pull it tight, it should be one continuous strip. You definitely want to check that before you go to the back and trim away about 1/4 of an inch away from that stitching. So I like to do that as I'm piecing them together. Some people chain piece them and then trim it all at one time. It's going to be a preference to what you like. So now I will continue to do that with the rest of my strips. So after I sew the first and second strip together, my second strip will now become right side up, and then my third strip would be flipped over, wrong side up, right side down, kissing each other, about 1/4 of an inch overhang on each side, and then sewed on the diagonal. And you will continue that until you have all your strips that you need. The next thing that we're going to do is we are going to press them. So what I like to do first is go find all of my seams and press those open. Pressing them open will now also reduce more of that bulk. That's why we sewed on the diagonal, and pressing it open. You can easily just press your strip in half, wrong sides together, right sides out, just like that, lining up the raw edges together and pressing it. Or we have this handy little tool. So I just press it to get it started. And then I like to use the Quilted Heart. It's called Binding Ease. We do have these for sale in a pink color. And what this does is that I just slip my strip in between the slots. The slots are different sizes, so depending on how I like to do my binding, I can do it bigger or smaller. And then you set your iron just right there in the middle. Now, this is my project iron. It is a little bit smaller. It is lightweight. So if you see it sliding while I'm pulling this, it's just because it's not heavy enough. But when you have a normal iron, it works perfect. So what you do is you just guide it through and you pull your strips, and it's getting that perfect fold and press to make your binding. And what I'm doing here at the other side is just making sure that they're lined up and pulling it through. Making binding is an ease. Now I'm coming to the part where I join my strips together. There is no bulk because I pressed that seam open. And usually you have a lot more room to do this than I do. But if you don't, it shows how easy it is to make binding in a small space. We also have what's called the binding wheel, which is really, really cool. You snap one side of your binding in a little clip, and then you roll it all on a wheel so it has it all together for you. I either just like to have it hanging down, or I roll it up so it doesn't get twisted. So now you can see that we have it all nicely pressed. The next thing we want to do is we're going to turn to the back side of our project or our quilt. I have 1/4 of an inch started right now. I am going to do raw edge to my raw edge, so my fold needs to be on the inside. I start on one side of my quilt, kind of in the middle, and I start about 3 to 4 inches down. We want to have some some knot stitched to overlay it to connect it later on. So now I'm just going to do 1/4 of an inch. When I get to a corner, whenever you get to the corner, you want to stitch about 1/4 away from the edge, and then you are going to turn it's sideways where the edge of the corner is facing you now of your project or your quilt, and you are going to sew straight off of it. So I'm going to let you look at that from the front and then from the back. So I sewed about 1/4 of an inch away from my edge and then sewed straight off on the diagonal to that corner. After I do that, I'm now going to make a corner for my binding. What I like to do is press it upwards to make a loop, a little fold, and then I maneuver my fold down where the fold is now touching the edge of my quilt and my raw edges are lined up to the edge. So I have this little fold right here. We are now going to sew all the way down the side, 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to do the same thing when I get to the next corner. I sew till I'm about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. I turn it to where the point of the corner is facing me, and then I'm going to sew off at a diagonal. Okay. Same thing, I'm pushing up to make my fold. I'm lining my fold up with the edge of my fabric. The edge of my binding is touching there, and now I'm going to stitch down the side. So all the way down this side, 1/4 of an inch. Oh, I'm on my binding down there. That's why I like to have it folded up or on that binding rail. I'm getting to my next corner. I'm sewing to almost 1/4 of a way. I'm turning it so that point is facing me, sewing at a diagonal off that point, making another fold. I'm lining it all up and stitching down it, and do the same thing for the last corner. So now I'm on my last side of where I need to connect it. I'm going to do the same thing on my corner. Line it up and stitch it down. Except instead of stitching it all the way down where it's almost touching here, I'm just going to stitch down a little way because I want 2 flaps to be able to connect the two. This is where they're all huddling around me to see if I'm doing it right. So I have my first flap laid down. I'm putting my top flap on top of it. I wanted them to overlap about 2.5 inches or a little past 2.5. Okay. So now they're clipped, they're overlapping. I need to connect them. So when they're laying just like this, we need to connect them just like we did the first time, where one's facing right side up and then the other one's facing right side down, kissing each other. So how I do that, I'm going to turn it vertical. I'm going to put my top piece facing up, my bottom piece facing down. This is a little quilt, so it's kind of a little challenging. I have them kissing each other just like that. And I'm still going to do the sew from the left to the right, except that this is just the left top down to the bottom right. And if you need to put pins to hold it in place, definitely do so. You don't have to make it complicated like it looks right here with me. It's just that this is a small little piece, so. Okay, moment of truth. Dun, dun, dun. So after I have connected my strips, I do not want to trim this right away. I want to lay them down for a couple of reasons. One, I want to make sure it's folded and not twisted. Can we all get a round of applause? Like I said, I do this on a daily basis, and it's like I couldn't do it a while ago. So we want to make sure it's not twisted. Second, when we lay it down, we want to make sure that it's going to reach the amount that we still need to stitch. So it does, so we can go ahead and trim. And then we can either finger press this open, or we can take it to the iron and press it open. I'm just going to finger press it for the time being. Okay, so now we have it all nice and folded and ready to go. What I also like to do is to put a pin right in the center of it so that I don't get any gapping or puckering in between. And then now what we're going to do is just sew 1/4 inch like we did before. I'm making sure that my raw edges are lined up. And I'm just sewing until I'm overlapping my stitches. And that is attaching my binding. The next thing that we're going to do is a 2-step ironing process. Okay. And I would like to have pins or clips available if you have them, just because if you're starting to learn how to machine bind, it definitely makes it a lot easier. So my first step is I want to press my binding out and get a good crisp press right up to my stitches, what I did. So it's going to turn the outside and give it a good press. So this is step 1. It's really important to take the time and not speed through attaching your binding if you want to get a good, even binding on the front. So that's step 1. I pressed it all out. Step 2, we're flipping to the front of our quilt, and we are now going to fold it over and press it this way. This is the point where you want pins or glue or clips to clip it in place after you pressed it so that you can get a good even distribute of the same amount of binding to the front. So you can see that I have pressed the side piece, and now I'm going to the corner where I want to press the top. So what you're just going to do is just flip it over, making sure the corner matches, and you're just going to press it again. And usually you have a pretty long ironing board where you don't have to do this. Okay. Got to my next point, same thing, folding it over, making sure my corners match, and then my bottom piece. Now I don't have clips with me, so I'm going to eyeball it, and we are going to get started now. Top stitching. So I like to go ahead and put my zigzag foot on. I leave my needle in the center, but on my zigzag foot, I do have a marking where it says it's the center of my foot. And I like to put the edge of my binding, that fold, right past it just a smidge so I can top stitch and barely catch it. Now that will put me a little past my binding on the back side, hence that's why we use the same color bobbin as our backing. But if you were wanting to put it exactly in that ditch, you would have to, you could see that stitching that you did to connect it, and you would want to fold it over and place that right on top of that and line that up. So then when you flip it over to the back, it will fall right in the ditch of that binding. So we have it folded over. I like to start at a corner to make sure that my corner is all matched up. I have the matching top thread. Let me change my foot real fast. And then now I'm going to top stitch my binding down. I'm going to do this kind of quickly, so if it's not perfect or close to perfect, I do apologize. And you would have your clips or your glue or your pins, whichever you prefer, holding it in place for you to make sure that you're perfectly getting the same amount throughout the whole quilt. Now when I get to my corner, I just barely stitch, let my foot come up, rotate it over, and continue stitching so I'm not clipping my threads any. And you can see I'm about to go over where I pieced it together. It went over it smoothly, no problems. That's because I pieced on the diagonal and I pressed open. And we're almost done. At the end, I do like to backstitch just to secure it. And we are done top stitching our machine binding. Now, I will say, look how pretty my corners. If you would like to, you can. There is a little catch where this is open a little bit. You can stitch those down if you would like to. So all you would do is when you get to a corner, stitch it down, back stitch, and then continue on. That's going to be a preference up to you. And then you can see the back that there is a line all the way around, but it's not noticeable standing away from you because it matches the back. Just don't forget that if you're wanting a smaller binding on the front, that you're going to match stitching in the ditch on the back. You're going to line it up with that stitch mark when you first attached it to the back. But that is our machine binding demo. If you didn't watch with us live on Facebook, you can catch it on YouTube. We'll see you later, guys. Bye.